A woman sees a black man holding her purse and instantly assumes he was trying to steal it, so she has a meltdown. She is so enraged that she pepper sprays the black man. However, she never expected what came next. David strolled through the park on his way home from work, the late afternoon sun casting golden streaks across the green expanse. He loved this route. Kids played tag on the grass, joggers passed with nods of acknowledgement, and couples walked hand in hand. It was a place of simple joy, a brief respite from the pressures of the world. As he passed a bench near the fountain, a glint of light caught his eye. A sleek black leather purse sat alone, its owner nowhere in sight. He slowed, looking around for someone who might have left it behind. David hesitated. It wasn't in his nature to ignore something like this, but experience had taught him to tread carefully. Sighing, he picked up the purse, holding it by its strap to avoid any misunderstanding. "Excuse me," he called to a man walking by, who shook his head and kept moving. A woman jogging past gave him a glance, but no response. David stood there for a moment, scanning the area. Then he spotted her, blonde hair tied back, pacing near the park's edge. She was gesturing wildly, her body language tense. Her lips moved as though she were muttering or calling out. That must be her, David thought. He walked toward her, the purse dangling conspicuously from his hand. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said when he got close enough. "I think you left this behind." She turned sharply, her eyes immediately locking on the purse. Relief flashed across her face for an instant before it twisted into suspicion. "That's my purse," she snapped, lunging forward and snatching it from his grasp. "What are you doing with it?" David stepped back, startled. "I found it on a bench," he explained. "I thought you'd—" "Don't you dare lie to me," she shouted, clutching the purse against her chest. "You stole it, didn't you?" "What?" David blinked. "No, I didn't. I was just trying to help." "You expect me to believe that?" Her voice grew louder, shrill enough to make nearby heads turn. "I know what you were doing. Probably rummaging through it while you decided what to take." David raised his hands, his patience already fraying. "Look, lady, I didn't even open it. I just—" "You thief!" she spat, cutting him off. Her voice echoed across the park, drawing more and more attention. David sighed, realizing he was already losing this battle. David took a step back, keeping his hands raised, the weight of the growing stairs around him pressing against his chest. Karen clutched her purse like a life preserver, her face a mask of indignation. "Ma'am," David said, his tone calm but firm, "I don't know what you're accusing me of, but I was just trying to do the right thing. I found your purse on the bench, and I brought it over." Karen scoffed, her expression hardening. "Do you think I'm stupid? You had no business touching my things. You're just mad I caught you before you could get away with it." David let out a sharp breath, glancing around at the growing crowd. A jogger paused mid-stride, her earbuds dangling as she watched the scene unfold. A mother pulling a wagon full of toddlers stopped, her brows furrowed in curiosity. "You didn't catch me doing anything," David replied evenly. "I was handing it back to you. Why would I stick around if I was trying to steal it?" Karen took a step closer, pointing an accusatory finger at his chest. "Because you wanted to play the hero. Pretend to be the good guy so no one would suspect you. I've seen this trick before." David shook his head in disbelief. "Lady, I don't even know you. I was trying to help." "That's what they always say," she shot back, her voice climbing in pitch. "You people think you can get away with anything." David froze, her words hitting him like a slap. "Excuse me?" he said, his voice hardening. Karen's lips curled into a smug smile, emboldened by the murmurs of some onlookers. "Oh, don't play dumb. You know exactly what I mean." "You're really going there?" David said, his voice sharp now. "You're accusing me of stealing, peppering it with stereotypes, and you think that makes you right?" Her face flushed red. Whether from anger or embarrassment, it was hard to tell. "I don't have to explain myself to you. I know a thief when I see one." More bystanders gathered, their whispers buzzing like static electricity. A young man with a smartphone discreetly aimed his camera toward the unfolding drama. Another bystander, A gray-haired man leaning on a cane shook his head. "Let the man speak, lady," he muttered. David turned to the onlookers, his frustration bubbling over. "Does this make sense to anyone here? Why would I bring the purse back if I was trying to steal it?" "He's got a point," the young man with the phone said aloud. Karen glared at him. "Stay out of this. You don't know what he's capable of." "What I'm capable of," David snapped, his voice rising for the first time. "Are you even listening to yourself? All I did was try to help, and now you're dragging me through this circus." Karen clutched her purse tighter, her knuckles white. "You had no right to touch my property. Who knows what you were planning to do?" David let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Next time, I'll leave it where I found it. Maybe then you'll have someone real to blame." The tension reached a boiling point as Karen raised her voice again. "You're not going anywhere. I'm calling the police." David froze, his stomach dropping. "You're serious?" he asked, incredulous. "You're really calling the cops on me for trying to help you?" "Yes, I am," she said, already fumbling with her phone. "Let them sort this out." "Good," David said, folding his arms. "Maybe they'll be reasonable enough to see how ridiculous this is." Karen dialed with trembling fingers, her words sharp and deliberate as she spoke into the phone. "Yes, officer. I need help. There's a man here. He tried to steal my purse. He's being aggressive, and I don't feel safe." David's jaw clenched as he caught the murmurs of the crowd. Words like aggressive and unsafe weren't just descriptions. They were weapons. A middle-aged woman with a stroller stepped forward, shaking her head. "I saw him pick it up and walk over to you. He didn't do anything wrong." "Stay out of this," Karen barked. "You don't know the whole story." The young man with the smartphone raised his voice. "I've got the whole thing on video. You're making a scene over nothing." Karen's head snapped toward him, her confidence faltering for the first time. "You, what?" "That's right," he said, holding up his phone. "You're not gonna spin this." David wiped a hand over his face, his anger threatening to spill over. "This is unbelievable," he muttered. "You just can't admit you're wrong, can you?" Karen's eyes darted between the crowd and David, her bravado slipping. "I don't care what any of you say," she spat. "I know what I saw, and the police will too." David stood firm, his frustration bubbling over. His patience had run out, and the injustice of the situation clawed at him. "Lady, you're ridiculous," David snapped, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "You're out here accusing me of stealing when I was just trying to help you. You can't even admit you're wrong." Karen's eyes widened, and her face flushed a deep crimson. "How dare you speak to me like that?" she shrieked, her voice trembling with indignation. "You think you can intimidate me into backing down? You don't scare me." "I'm not trying to scare you," David retorted, taking a step forward. "But maybe I should, considering the way you're acting. You're calling me a thief for no reason, and treating me like garbage just because I tried to do the right thing." The crowd murmured louder, a mix of agreement and discomfort rippling through the onlookers. Some had their phones raised, recording the escalating exchange. A young woman whispered to her friend, "He's right. She's completely losing it." Karen's grip tightened on the strap of her purse. "Oh, don't try to play the victim now. I've seen your type before. You think you're so clever, but you're not fooling me." David's jaw tightened, his anger boiling over. "You don't know a damn thing about me," he barked, his voice echoing. "I've had it with people like you, people who jump to conclusions and treat others like trash because of your narrow-minded nonsense." Karen flinched, but quickly recovered, her face contorting with fury. "People like me? No, it's people like you who think you can get away with anything." "Get away with what?" David shot back, his voice rising further. "Returning your stupid purse? I don't need anything from you, and I sure as hell didn't deserve this crap." Karen stumbled back a step, her eyes darting nervously to the crowd, now fully captivated by the scene. Her voice wavered, but her resolve hardened. "You're not going to bully me," she screamed, her hand diving into her purse. "I'm defending myself." David froze as she pulled out a small canister. "Wait, what are you doing?" Before he could react, Karen pressed the nozzle and unleashed a stream of pepper spray directly into his face. David cried out in pain, stumbling back and clawing at his eyes. "Are you kidding me?" he shouted, his voice raw and broken. "You just sprayed me? Are you out of your mind?" The crowd erupted in gasps and shouts. "You're crazy!" someone yelled. "He didn't even touch her," another voice chimed in. Karen stood her ground, the pepper spray can still clutched in her hand. "He was being aggressive," she insisted, her voice rising in desperation. "I felt threatened." David dropped to his knees, his hands pressed against his face as tears streamed down. "Threatened?" he choked out between coughs. "I was walking away." "You're unbelievable." A middle-aged woman rushed forward with a water bottle, crouching beside David. "Here, try to flush it out," she said softly, her tone heavy with concern. "Don't rub your eyes. It'll make it worse." Karen pointed at the woman, her voice sharp and defensive. "Stay back! You don't know what he's capable of." "Capable of what?" the young man with the smartphone demanded, stepping forward. "I've got the whole thing on video. You just attacked him for no reason." Karen's face twisted, panic flickering in her eyes. "That's not true. He was threatening me. You didn't see the way he came at me." "I saw the whole thing," another bystander shouted. "He didn't do anything but argue with you after you called him a thief." David struggled to his feet, his eyes still streaming. His voice, hoarse but loud, rang out. "You're a coward, you know that?" he bellowed, his frustration and pain fueling his words. "You can't stand being wrong, so you'd rather double down and hurt someone who didn't do a damn thing to you." Karen shrank back slightly, but her indignation flared again. "Don't try to turn this on me. You're the one who caused all this. You did this to yourself," David shot back, his voice raw and defiant. "You had the chance to just take your purse and leave. But no, you had to make me the bad guy. You couldn't handle the truth if it hit you in the face." The crowd's murmurs grew louder, their phones capturing every second. "She's lost it," someone muttered. In the distance, the sound of sirens grew louder. Karen's head snapped toward the noise, her face a mix of relief and fear. "Good," she said, her voice trembling. "Let the police deal with this. They'll see what kind of person you really are." David coughed again, his chest heaving. "Yeah," he said bitterly, his voice steady despite the pain. "Let's see how this plays out for you." The sirens grew closer, the flashing lights of a patrol car reflecting in the eyes of the crowd. The tension hung thick in the air. Every breath waited with anticipation. The patrol car rolled to a stop at the park's edge, its sirens silencing, but the lights continuing to flash, casting a red and blue glow over the tense crowd. An officer stepped out, scanning the scene. His eyes landed on David, who was still wiping his pepper-sprayed eyes, and then on Karen, who stood rigid with the canister still clutched in her hand. "What's going on here?" the officer demanded, his voice calm but commanding as he approached the center of the chaos. Karen was the first to speak, rushing forward as if she had been eagerly waiting for her moment. "Thank goodness you're here, officer. That man," she said, jabbing a finger toward David, "tried to steal my purse. When I confronted him, he became aggressive. I had no choice but to defend myself." David, still wincing in pain, straightened as much as he could. His voice, though hoarse, carried his frustration clearly. "That's not true. I found her purse on a bench and tried to return it. She started yelling at me, accused me of stealing, and then pepper-sprayed me for no reason." The officer raised a hand to quiet them both, his gaze darting between Karen's defiant posture and David's obvious discomfort. "All right, let's take a step back. Sir, you're saying you didn't steal the purse?" David nodded firmly. "That's right. I didn't even open it. I saw it on a bench, figured someone must have left it behind, and brought it to her." Karen scoffed loudly, her voice dripping with indignation. "He's lying. He probably saw me put it down and waited for a chance to grab it. I know how these types operate." David's jaw clenched at her choice of words. "These types," he repeated, his voice rising. "You've been making these baseless accusations since I handed you the damn purse. You're the one who escalated this." The officer held up a hand again, Ma'am, let's stick to the facts. Do you have any evidence he was trying to steal your purse? Karen faltered for a moment, but quickly recovered. Evidence? It was in his hands, wasn't it? What more do you need? A voice from the crowd interrupted. He was giving it back to you, lady. I saw it. The officer turned toward the onlookers. Did anyone here see what happened? A young man stepped forward, holding up his phone. I've got the whole thing on video. He picked up the purse and walked straight over to her. She started freaking out and sprayed him when he didn't back down. Karen's face paled, but she quickly turned to the officer, her voice trembling with indignation. You're going to take the word of some random guy with a camera? You can't see what he was planning to do. I felt unsafe. That's why I acted. David, still blinking away the burning in his eyes, pointed in her direction. Unsafe? That's your excuse? You attacked me because I didn't just bow down to your ridiculous accusations. Karen glared at him, her grip on the pepper spray canister tightening. You were yelling at me. I thought you were going to hurt me. You were yelling at him first, someone in the crowd shouted, their voice cutting through the tension. The officer turned back to Karen, his tone more serious now. Ma'am, if what he's saying is true, and you sprayed him without cause, that's assault. And if you've misrepresented the situation to the police, that's a false report. Karen's eyes widened, panic flickering briefly before she doubled down. This is absurd. I'm the victim here. You don't understand how terrifying it was. He was towering over me, shouting. I had to protect myself. David laughed bitterly, shaking his head. You're unbelievable. I was standing there trying to explain, and you couldn't handle being called out. You wanted me to look like the bad guy so you could justify your actions. Enough, the officer said sharply, silencing the argument. He turned to the man with the phone. Can I see the video? The man stepped forward, handing over his phone. The officer played the footage, the sound of Karen's accusations and David's calm voice playing out for all to hear. When the moment came where Karen pepper-sprayed David, the officer's jaw tightened visibly. He handed the phone back, his gaze now cold and focused on Karen. Ma'am, the video doesn't support your claims. It shows him returning your purse and you escalating the situation. Karen's bravado faltered, but she quickly snapped back, her voice rising in pitch. You don't know what he was planning. That video doesn't show the whole story. It shows enough, the officer replied flatly. He looked back at David. Sir, are you pressing charges? Karen turned sharply toward David, her face twisted in desperation and fury. You can't do this to me. I was just trying to protect myself. You don't know how scared I was. David held her gaze, his anger simmering but controlled. You weren't scared, he said, his voice steady. You were just looking for an excuse. The officer stepped between them. That's enough. Ma'am, if you don't calm down, I'll have no choice but to take you into custody for assault. Karen's protests continued, her voice blending with the murmurs of the crowd as the scene teetered on the edge of resolution. The tension hung thick in the air, neither party willing to back down as the officer weighed his next move. Karen's face was a mask of panic, rage, and disbelief as the officer's calm yet firm words hit her like a hammer. Her grip on the pepper spray canister was unrelenting, her knuckles white against the black plastic. This is ridiculous, Karen shrieked, her voice breaking as she stepped back, her eyes darting between the officer and David. You're all taking his side. He's lying. He's manipulating all of you. David, standing taller now, despite the lingering sting in his eyes, met her gaze with quiet defiance. No one's manipulating anyone, he said, his voice steady but cold. You're just mad that your story doesn't hold up. Karen's breath hitched, and she pointed a trembling finger at him. You don't get to talk to me like that. I am the victim here. You're all against me because he knows how to play you. The officer raised his hand, his voice sharp. Ma'am, I need you to calm down. We've seen enough to know this isn't what you're claiming. Karen let out a high-pitched laugh, her hysteria mounting. Calm down? Calm down? I was attacked. I felt unsafe. What else was I supposed to do? Not pepper spray someone returning your purse, for starters. muttered the young man, holding his phone, still recording. Karen's head whipped toward him, her face twisted with rage. "You stop filming me! You don't have my permission!" she shouted, her voice cracking. "Pretty sure I don't need it," the young man replied flatly, not lowering his phone. David took a step closer, his gaze never leaving Karen. "You don't want people to see the truth, do you? You can't handle the fact that you're wrong." Karen's hands began to tremble, her grip on the pepper spray loosening slightly. "Shut up!" she screamed. "You don't get to talk to me like that. You're a liar, a thief." "Ma'am," the officer interrupted, his voice firm but not unkind. "Put the pepper spray down. Right now." Karen's wild eyes flicked to the officer, then to the crowd, which had grown visibly hostile. Her breathing quickened, and her words came out in frantic gasps. "You don't understand. You weren't here. You didn't see the way he looked at me. He was coming after me." David exhaled sharply, his patience finally snapping. "I wasn't coming after you. I was standing there, explaining myself, while you made me out to be a monster. And now that everyone knows the truth, you're falling apart." Karen's face twisted with fury, and she took an unsteady step toward him. The officer quickly stepped between them, his hand raised to block her. "That's enough, ma'am," he said, his tone now steely. "Step back. You can't do this to me," Karen wailed, her voice breaking into a sob. "I'm not the criminal here. He is. Arrest him. He's the one who started all of this." The officer shook his head. "Ma'am, you're not in a position to make demands. Put the pepper spray down and cooperate, or I'll have to arrest you for assault." Karen stumbled backward, clutching the canister tighter as tears streamed down her face. Her words came in frantic, incoherent bursts. "You can't arrest me. I was scared. He was dangerous." "I didn't do anything wrong." The officer took a step closer, his tone now unyielding. "Ma'am, this is your last warning. Drop the pepper spray, or I'll have to place you under arrest." "No!" Karen shrieked, her entire body trembling. "You're ruining my life! He's ruining my life!" The crowd murmured louder, their disdain for Karen's actions clear in their voices. "Just arrest her already," someone muttered. Karen's eyes darted around the circle of faces, her panic boiling over. "You're all against me. You don't know what it's like to feel this kind of fear. I'm the victim. Me!" The officer moved closer, his hand hovering near his belt. "Ma'am, if you don't comply, I'll have no choice but to restrain you." Karen's lip curled, her desperation morphing into raw defiance. She gripped the pepper spray tightly, her knuckles trembling. "You can't arrest me. I was protecting myself. You can't take me in," she screamed, jerking her arm away as the officer reached out. Her wild movement caused the crowd to gasp collectively. The officer's voice rose sharply. "Ma'am, stop resisting!" Karen struggled against his attempt to grab her wrist, her voice a piercing wail. "You're all against me. This isn't fair," she screeched, her entire body thrashing as the officer held her arm firmly. David watched silently, his expression a mix of frustration and disbelief. The weight of the scene bore down on him as Karen's meltdown reached its peak, her cries echoing across the park. The officer's patience visibly waned, his grip steady as he repeated, "Stop resisting, ma'am! Don't make this worse for yourself." Karen's cries turned guttural, her words incomprehensible as she thrashed harder. The officer moved to restrain her further, his handcuffs glinting in the dimming light. The officer tightened his grip on Karen's arm, his tone sharp and unyielding. "Ma'am, I'm telling you one last time, stop resisting." Karen thrashed violently, her voice a cacophony of sobs and screams. "No, you don't understand. I didn't do anything wrong. He's the one you should be arresting." The crowd murmured louder, their patience with her theatrics wearing thin. "Just take her in already," someone muttered. Karen twisted again, her movements frantic. "Let me go!" she shrieked, her face red and streaked with tears. "I'm not going anywhere. You're all making a mistake." The officer acted swiftly, pulling her arm behind her back and snapping the handcuffs onto her wrists. Karen's wail cut through the air like a siren. "You can't do this to me. I'm the victim. He's dangerous." "Ma'am," the officer said, his voice cold now, You're under arrest for assault, resisting arrest, and filing a false report. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Karen's knees buckled slightly, and the officer steadied her as he continued. "You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford one, one will be provided for you. Do you understand these rights?" Karen barely registered the words, her sobs turning into incoherent babbling. "This isn't fair. You're ruining my life. You don't know what this will do to me." David, who had been silently watching, finally spoke, his voice calm but cutting. "You did this to yourself. No one else." Karen's head snapped toward him, her tear-streaked face twisted with fury. "You shut up!" she screamed. "This is your fault. You set me up. You and all these people. You planned this, didn't you?" David crossed his arms, unmoved. "Yeah, because I plan all my days around returning lost purses and getting pepper sprayed." "Makes perfect sense." The crowd chuckled softly at his sarcasm, further enraging Karen. "You think this is funny?" She spat, her voice hoarse. "You'll regret this. All of you! Enough!" the officer said firmly, steering her toward the patrol car. She resisted every step, her feet dragging along the pavement. "I'll sue all of you!" she shouted, her voice cracking. "I'll ruin you! You'll see!" As the officer opened the car door and maneuvered her inside, Karen's cries turned guttural. "I'm innocent! You're all blind!" she wailed, kicking futilely at the air before the door shut with a heavy thud. The crowd began to disperse slowly, their murmurs filled with a mixture of relief and disbelief. A middle-aged woman pushed her stroller away, muttering, "Good riddance." The young man with the phone approached David, holding the screen up. "This is already trending," he said, showing the video uploaded to social media. "People are going to see what really happened." David exhaled heavily, his shoulders sagging. "I appreciate it," he said, his tone weary. "It's just hard to process." The officer returned, his demeanor softening as he addressed David. "Sir, are you all right? We can get you medical attention if you need it." David shook his head. "I'll be fine. I just need a minute." The officer nodded. "I still need you to come down to the station to file your statement." "Are you pressing charges?" David hesitated, his eyes following the patrol car as it pulled away, Karen's muffled screams still faintly audible. "Yeah," he said finally, his voice firm. "She needs to face the consequences." "That's the right call," the officer said. What she did was completely out of line. As the crowd thinned, a few bystanders approached David, offering words of support. The woman with the stroller gave him a soft pat on the arm. "You handled that well," she said. "Not sure I could have stayed so calm." David managed a small, tired smile. "Thanks," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. The young man with the phone lingered, his expression serious. "Hey, if you need the video for your case or anything, just let me know." "It's not right, what she did to you." David nodded. "I appreciate that. Really." The weight of the evening settled heavily on his shoulders as the last of the bystanders drifted away. The park felt eerily quiet now, the chaos replaced with an uneasy stillness. David rubbed his eyes, still feeling the lingering burn of the pepper spray, and let out a long breath. As the patrol car carrying Karen disappeared down the street, the park quieted, leaving David standing amid the thinning crowd. His eyes burned from the lingering effects of the pepper spray, and his body ached from the tension of the confrontation. A different patrol car pulled up to the park, and a new officer stepped out, clipboard in hand. He approached David, his expression professional but not unkind. "Are you Mr. Robinson?" David nodded, his shoulders still stiff. "Yeah, that's me." The officer scanned his notes briefly before speaking. "We need you to come to the station to give a formal statement. Do you need a ride, or can you get there on your own?" David hesitated, glancing at the crowd where a few people lingered, watching him with quiet support. The young man with the phone stepped forward, offering a thumbs up. "You good, man?" David gave a faint nod, then turned to the officer. "I'll come with you." "All right," the officer said, leading him to the waiting patrol car. David climbed into the back, his body sagging into the seat as the door shut behind him. The drive to the station was silent, save for the faint hum of the engine and the muted chatter over the police radio. David stared out the window, the city lights blurring together as his thoughts churned. Inside the station, the stark fluorescent lighting and muted tones of beige walls gave the room a sterile atmosphere. David sat at a desk near the front, a paper cup of water in his hands as he waited. The bustling sounds of officers moving through the space, typing, phones ringing, muted conversations, created a strange sense of normalcy that felt at odds with the chaos he had just endured. After a few minutes, an officer approached, his badge gleaming under the overhead light. "Mr. Robinson, we're ready for your statement. Follow me." David stood, his legs stiff as he followed the officer into a small interview room. A metal table sat in the center with 2 chairs, and a recording device blinked steadily at the corner of the table. The officer motioned for him to sit, and took the seat across from him. "Let's start from the beginning," the officer said, pen poised over a notepad. "Tell me what happened in the park." David took a deep breath, organizing his thoughts. "I was walking home from work, and I saw a purse left on a bench. No one was around, so I picked it up to return it. I saw this woman, Karen, nearby, looking like she'd lost something, so I went over to her." The officer nodded, jotting notes. "And then?" David's jaw tightened as he spoke. "I tried to give it to her, but before I could explain, she grabbed it and accused me of stealing it. She started yelling, making all kinds of accusations." "What kind of accusations?" the officer asked, his tone steady but probing. David exhaled sharply. "She said things like, 'You people,' and 'your type.' You know what she meant." The officer's pen paused briefly before continuing. "Go on." "I tried to explain that I found the purse, but she wouldn't listen. She called me a thief. And when I told her she was wrong, she pulled out pepper spray and hit me with it. I didn't touch her. I didn't even raise my voice until she started attacking me." The officer nodded, his eyes narrowing. "And what happened after that?" David shrugged slightly, his exhaustion showing. "The crowd got involved. Some people defended me, others didn't. She called the police and made it sound like I'd attacked her. But when the first officer got there, the truth came out because of the video and the witnesses." The officer tapped his pen against the pad thoughtfully. "I've reviewed the footage we received, and your account aligns perfectly with what we've seen. This is an open and shut case against her." David nodded, but remained quiet, the weight of the situation still pressing on him. "Pressing charges was the right move," the officer continued. "We've already filed for assault, filing a false report, and resisting arrest. She'll be arraigned tomorrow." David leaned back slightly in his chair. "What happens next?" "She'll go through the legal process. Given the evidence, she'll likely face penalties. You may need to testify, but with the video and witnesses, your case is strong." David rubbed his temples, the tension easing slightly. "I'll do what I have to." The officer stood, gathering his notes. "That's all we need for now. You're free to go, but we'll contact you if we need anything further." David left the interview room, his thoughts swirling as he made his way back to the lobby. He was surprised to see the young man with the phone still waiting. The man raised a hand in greeting as David approached. "Hey, man. Just wanted to make sure you're all right," he said, his voice casual but concerned. "That video's already blowing up online. People are going to see what really happened." David managed a tired smile. "Thanks for sticking around. I appreciate it." The young man nodded. "People need to know about stuff like this. Don't let her get away with it." "I won't," David said firmly, his voice steady. He stepped outside into the cool night air, letting it wash over him as he prepared for whatever came next. Karen sat in the dimly lit holding cell at the police station, her hands still trembling from the handcuffs that had been removed earlier. Her hair, once neatly styled, was now disheveled, and her face bore the streaks of dried tears and smeared makeup. The reality of her situation began to sink in as the muffled sounds of officers and detainees echoed through the halls. Her phone, confiscated during her arrest, was no longer her shield from the outside world. She had no way of knowing what was happening beyond these walls, but she could sense the weight of her actions creeping closer, ready to crush what was left of her carefully curated life. Meanwhile, Outside the station, the viral video continued to spread like wildfire. Clips of the confrontation, Karen's shrill accusations, her pepper spray attack, and her subsequent meltdown were shared across social media platforms. Memes and commentary flooded in, turning her into the latest symbol of entitlement and racial bias. At Karen's workplace, the fallout was swift. Her manager, Amanda, received dozens of emails and calls from colleagues, clients, and even strangers demanding action. A coworker forwarded the video with the subject line, "Is this Karen from accounting?" Amanda sighed heavily as she hit play on the video, her face growing more serious with every passing second. By the end, she picked up her phone and dialed HR. "We need to talk," she said curtly. "Now." At home, Karen's husband sat on the couch, staring at his phone in disbelief. His social media feed was flooded with tags, private messages, and reposts of the video. Friends and acquaintances bombarded him with questions. "Is this your wife? What the hell happened? Did Karen really do this?" He scrolled through the comments, each one harsher than the last. Classic Karen behavior. "Entitled and racist. What else is new? This lady should be in jail for what she did. Hope the guy sues her for everything she has." The weight of public opinion crushed him as he buried his face in his hands. He glanced toward the door, half expecting Karen to walk in and explain herself. But she wouldn't. Not tonight. Back at the station, Karen was finally called into a small room where a public defender sat waiting for her. His demeanor was professional, but distant as he slid a folder across the table. "Ms. Miller," he began, his voice measured, "I've reviewed the charges against you, as well as the evidence. It doesn't look good." Karen's hands balled into fists, her jaw tightening. "You don't understand," she snapped. "I was scared. That man, he was yelling at me. And I panicked. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." The lawyer adjusted his glasses, his tone unchanging. "The video evidence contradicts your account. It shows Mr. Robinson calmly trying to return your purse while you escalated the situation. Your use of pepper spray was unprovoked." Karen's face flushed, and she leaned forward. "You weren't there. You didn't see the way he looked at me. He was intimidating." "Intimidation isn't a crime," the lawyer replied coolly. "But assault is. And so is filing a false police report." Karen's chest tightened, her breath quickening. "So what are you saying? That I'm guilty? That this is all my fault?" The lawyer met her gaze without flinching. "Yes, Ms. Miller, that's exactly what I'm saying. And if you want any chance of mitigating the damage, you need to cooperate fully with the court and show genuine remorse." "Remorse?" Karen spat, her voice rising. "For what? Trying to defend myself? For being scared?" The lawyer sighed, closing the folder in front of him. "For the harm you caused, Ms. Miller, both to Mr. Robinson and to yourself." Karen sat back in her chair, her body trembling with frustration and disbelief. She refused to accept it, refused to accept that the narrative had slipped so far out of her control. By the next morning, the news cycle had picked up the story. Karen's name trended alongside hashtags like Trencher Pepper Spray Karen and Tatters Accountability. Now, reporters camped outside the police station, hoping for a glimpse of her as she was transferred to her arraignment. David watched the coverage from the quiet of his apartment. The sting of the pepper spray had faded, but the memory of the confrontation remained sharp. His phone buzzed constantly with messages of support, offers for legal help, and media requests for interviews. One text caught his eye. It was from the young man who had filmed the video. "You're trending, man. People are on your side. Let me know if you need anything." David set the phone down, his expression thoughtful. The public's outrage over Karen's behavior was validating, but it couldn't erase what had happened. He didn't want to be known as the man who was pepper-sprayed for doing the right thing. He just wanted to move forward. At the station, Karen sat in her holding cell once more, the lawyer's words echoing in her mind. She had spent years crafting a life of comfort and control, only for it to unravel in a matter of hours. The world outside no longer felt like hers. It belonged to the people who had seen her at her worst, and they were eager to judge. She buried her face in her hands, Her thoughts a chaotic whirl of blame and regret. But deep down, one truth began to gnaw at her, no matter how much she tried to push it away. She had done this to herself. The morning sun filtered through the blinds in David's small apartment, casting long shadows across the living room floor. He sat at his kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee as his phone buzzed intermittently with notifications. Social media was alight with discussions about the video, and his inbox was flooded with messages of support, legal offers, and requests for interviews. David scrolled through the posts, his emotions conflicted. The public outrage over Karen's actions was satisfying in some ways. Justice, after all, required visibility. But it also left him uneasy. The incident had gone from a personal injustice to a viral spectacle overnight. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. David opened it to find a man in a suit standing there, holding a briefcase. "Mr. Robinson?" the man asked, his tone professional but kind. "Yes," David replied, tensing slightly. "Who's asking?" The man extended his hand. "I'm Mark Bennett. I'm with a civil rights organization, and we'd like to offer our support in your case." David raised an eyebrow, shaking the man's hand. "Support? How?" Bennett stepped inside when invited and placed his briefcase on the table. "We've seen the video, and frankly, what happened to you is a textbook example of racial profiling and misuse of force. We'd like to represent you if you choose to file a civil suit against Karen Miller." David folded his arms, leaning against the counter. "A civil suit?" "Yes," Bennett said, his voice calm but firm. "It would hold her financially accountable for the harm she caused you. Emotional distress, reputational damage, even the cost of medical treatment if necessary. Cases like yours set important precedents." David sighed, running a hand over his head. "Look, I just wanted to do the right thing. I didn't ask for any of this. And yet, here you are," Bennett said gently. "You didn't ask for this, but you have the opportunity to turn it into something bigger. Think about it." David nodded slowly. "I'll think about it." Meanwhile, Karen's world continued to collapse. News outlets aired segments dissecting the incident, with pundits lambasting her actions. Her workplace issued a public statement, announcing her suspension pending an internal review. By midday, she received the email she had been dreading. Subject: termination of employment. Karen read the email 3 times, her breath hitching as the words blurred together. The company cited her behavior as inconsistent with our core values and ethical standards. She slammed her laptop shut and screamed into the quiet of her now empty home. Her husband, Greg, stood cautiously in the doorway, his expression guarded. "Karen, we need to talk." Karen whipped around, her face blotchy with tears. "What is there to talk about? I've lost everything because of him. Because of you," Greg said bluntly. "You did this. You didn't just lose your temper. You showed the whole world who you are." Karen's jaw dropped, her voice faltering. "You're supposed to be on my side," Greg sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "I can't be on your side when you're wrong, Karen. Do you know what people are saying about us? About me? Our friends? Our neighbors? They've all seen that video." Karen's hands trembled as she gripped the back of a chair. "It's not fair. I was scared. I didn't mean for this to happen." "But it did," Greg said firmly. "And instead of owning up to it, you're still trying to make yourself the victim. How is that fair to anyone else? How is that fair to him?" Karen's defenses cracked, her voice breaking. "I don't know what to do anymore. I don't know how to fix this." "You can start by telling the truth," Greg said before leaving the room, the silence he left behind heavier than any words. David found himself at the community center later that afternoon, seeking solace in the place that had always grounded him. The children were already gone for the day, but the familiar hum of the space brought him a sense of calm. He sat on the edge of the stage, staring out at the empty room, when his co-worker Maria walked in. She approached cautiously, a stack of papers in her hands. "Hey," she said softly, sitting beside him. "How are you holding up?" David shrugged. "Surviving, I guess. It's a lot." Maria nodded, her expression sympathetic. "I saw the video. Everyone did. You're handling this better than most people would." David gave a small, humorless laugh. What choice do I have? I've been handling stuff like this my whole life. It's just never been this public before. She placed a hand on his shoulder. You're stronger than you think, and you're not alone in this. Everyone here has your back. David looked at her, his gratitude clear in his tired eyes. Thanks, Maria. That means a lot. As he sat in the quiet of the community center, David realized he was at a crossroads. The world had forced him into a spotlight he hadn't asked for, and now he had to decide what to do with it. The quiet hum of the community center lingered in David's mind as he walked home that evening, Maria's words of encouragement echoing with each step. He appreciated the support, but the weight of the situation still sat heavy on his chest. When he reached his apartment, the dim glow of his phone on the kitchen counter caught his eye. Notifications were still flooding in. Social media mentions, missed calls, and texts. David slumped into a chair, staring at the phone. Among the flood of messages, one from Mark Bennett, the civil rights lawyer, stood out. Mr. Robinson, if you've made your decision, we're ready to move forward with the suit. Call me any time to discuss. David rubbed his temple, weighing the choice. A lawsuit meant stepping further into the spotlight, opening himself up to scrutiny he didn't want. But as he thought back to Karen's venomous accusations and the searing pain of the pepper spray, a wave of anger surged through him. Why should she get away with it? Why shouldn't she be held accountable for everything she'd done? He picked up the phone and dialed. Mark answered almost immediately. Mr. Robinson, good evening. Have you made a decision? David exhaled, steadying his voice. Yeah, let's do it. Let's go ahead with the lawsuit. Mark's tone was calm but confident. That's the right call. We'll start by filing for damages, emotional distress, reputational harm, and assault-related costs. This will send a clear message that actions like hers have consequences. David nodded, though Mark couldn't see it. What's next? I'll prepare the necessary paperwork and file it first thing tomorrow, Mark said. You'll need to provide a formal statement about the incident and any supporting details, but we can handle the bulk of the legwork. I'll also keep you updated as we proceed. All right, David said, his voice firmer now. Thanks for your help. After ending the call, David sat back, staring at the ceiling. He wasn't looking for revenge, just justice. And now, for the first time, he felt like he might get it. The news of the lawsuit broke the next day, spreading quickly across media outlets and social platforms. Headlines like David Robinson files civil suit against pepper spray Karen dominated feeds, drawing even more attention to the case. Karen woke to the sound of her phone vibrating incessantly. She fumbled for it on the nightstand, her heart sinking as she read the notifications. David Robinson is suing you? Good luck explaining that in court. Hope you've got a good lawyer. You're going to need one. You deserve every bit of this. Disgusting. Her breath quickened as she threw the phone down. She couldn't escape it. Everywhere she turned, the world seemed hell-bent on punishing her. Greg, standing in the doorway with his arms crossed, didn't look surprised. It was only a matter of time, he said flatly. Karen glared at him. You're enjoying this, aren't you? No, Greg replied, his voice cold. But I'm not going to defend you anymore either. You brought this on yourself. Karen's jaw tightened, her desperation mounting. I'll fight it. I'll get a lawyer and prove he's just trying to ruin me. Greg shook his head, his expression one of weary resignation. Good luck with that, he said before walking out of the room. David met with Mark at his office later that afternoon. The room was lined with bookshelves, their spines gleaming under the soft light. Mark sat across from David at a polished wooden desk, a folder of documents spread between them. We're filing for damages totaling $200,000, Mark explained. This includes emotional distress, reputational harm, and punitive damages for the assault. David raised an eyebrow. You think it'll stick? With the video evidence and witnesses? Absolutely, Mark replied confidently. Her behavior was egregious, and the court will recognize that. David nodded slowly, flipping through the documents Mark had prepared. He paused, staring at a line detailing Karen's actions in the park. It's just surreal, he said quietly. I went from trying to help someone to suing them in less than a week. Mark leaned forward, his tone firm but understanding. It's not about the timeline, Mr. Robinson. It's about accountability. People like her need to learn that their actions have consequences. You're not just doing this for yourself. You're setting a precedent. David took a deep breath, the weight of the decision settling on him. Let's do it. The announcement of the lawsuit caused Karen's world to spiral further. Her lawyer, a harried man with salt and pepper hair, sat across from her in their first consultation. He didn't mince words. "Ms. Miller, the evidence against you is overwhelming. The video alone is damning, not to mention the witnesses. If this goes to trial, you're going to lose." Karen's face burned with humiliation. "So what do I do? Just roll over and let him win?" The lawyer sighed. "If you're smart, you'll settle. Apologize, offer a financial settlement, and hope he accepts it." "Settle?" Karen spat, her voice rising. "I'm not giving him a dime. This is all a ploy to ruin me." Her lawyer shook his head, closing the folder in front of him. "That kind of attitude is exactly why you're in this mess. If you don't take this seriously, you're going to lose everything." Karen sat back in her chair, her mind racing. She felt cornered, trapped by the walls closing in around her. And for the first time, she wondered if there was any way out. The courthouse buzzed with muted activity as David walked through the marble-floored hallway, Mark Bennett by his side. The smell of freshly polished wood and faint echoes of footsteps filled the space. David adjusted his tie nervously, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "Relax," Mark said, his tone calm but reassuring. "You've got the truth, the evidence, and the public on your side. Karen's lawyer knows that." David nodded but said nothing. He had been dreading this day, even knowing the odds were stacked in his favor. The idea of seeing Karen again, of hearing her justify what she'd done, left his stomach in knots. As they entered the courtroom, a few reporters outside jostled for photos and sound bites. Inside, the tension was thick. Karen sat at the defendant's table, her expression pinched and pale, her lawyer whispering furiously in her ear. She refused to look at David. The judge, an older woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, entered the courtroom, and the room settled into silence. "Mr. Robinson, Mr. Bennett, Ms. Miller, and counsel," she began, her tone firm. "I trust you understand the importance of today's proceedings. We're here to determine if this case will move to trial, or if a settlement can be reached." Karen's lawyer rose first, smoothing his tie. "Your Honor, we are prepared to offer a settlement to resolve this matter swiftly and without further escalation." David stiffened in his seat, exchanging a glance with Mark. Karen's lawyer continued, "Ms. Miller deeply regrets the events that took place and would like to extend an apology to Mr. Robinson for any distress caused. We propose a settlement of $50,000 to resolve this case amicably." David's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Mark stood. "Your Honor, while we appreciate the defendant's offer, $50,000 doesn't begin to address the harm caused to my client. This case isn't just about financial compensation. It's about accountability. We believe a trial is necessary to ensure justice is fully served." The judge leaned forward, her eyes sharp. "Mr. Robinson, you have the floor. Do you believe a trial is the best course of action, or are you open to a revised settlement?" David stood, his heart pounding. All eyes were on him, Karen's, the judge's, and even the small crowd in the gallery. He took a steadying breath. "Your Honor," he began, his voice clear, "this isn't just about the money. What happened to me was humiliating, painful, and unfair. I tried to help someone, and I was treated like a criminal because of assumptions and prejudice. People need to know that this behavior has consequences. A trial will send that message." Karen's lawyer looked visibly uncomfortable, leaning in to whisper frantically to her. Karen's face flushed red, her composure slipping as she shook her head, and whispered back furiously. The judge observed the exchange, her expression neutral but firm. "Ms. Miller, is there something you'd like to say?" Karen hesitated, her hands gripping the edge of the table. Her lawyer's warning glance didn't stop her from standing, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Your Honor, this has all been blown out of proportion," she said, her tone defensive. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I felt scared and threatened. I made a mistake. Yes, but I shouldn't have to lose everything over one bad moment. David met her gaze, his expression steady but unyielding. You didn't just make a mistake, he said, his voice firm but measured. You made a choice. You chose to accuse me. You chose to spray me. And you chose to double down instead of admitting you were wrong. Karen's face crumpled, her voice rising in pitch. You don't understand. Everyone has turned against me. My job, my family, my life. It's all gone because of this. And whose fault is that? David shot back, his voice ringing out. You did this to yourself. All I wanted was to help, and you turned me into the villain. Now you're upset because people are finally holding you accountable. The judge raised her hand, silencing the room. That's enough, she said sharply. She turned her gaze to Karen, her voice firm. Ms. Miller, you may not agree with the consequences of your actions, but you must accept responsibility for them. That's how justice works. Karen's lawyer whispered something urgently in her ear, and she slumped back into her seat, her face pale. The judge turned her attention to David and Mark. If both parties cannot agree to a revised settlement, this case will proceed to trial. Mark leaned toward David, his voice low. She's cornered. She'll settle for more if we push. But if you want a trial, I'll back you all the way. David hesitated, his mind racing. He thought of the countless messages of support he'd received. The strangers who had shared their own stories of injustice. He thought of how many people were watching, waiting for what he would do next. He turned back to Mark, his decision clear. Let's see how far she's willing to go. The courthouse buzzed with anticipation as the hearing resumed the following day. Overnight, news of David's refusal to accept the initial settlement offer spread, further amplifying public interest in the case. Reporters gathered outside, their voices blending into a chaotic hum as cameras flashed. Inside, the tension was palpable. David entered the courtroom, Mark walking beside him, his presence steady and reassuring. Karen was already seated at the defense table, her expression strained. Her lawyer sat beside her, shuffling through papers with the frenetic energy of someone trying to salvage a sinking ship. The judge entered, her gavel striking once to call the room to order. This court is now back in session to determine the resolution of Robinson versus Miller. After reviewing yesterday's discussions, I hope both parties are prepared to reach a conclusion today. Mark stood first, his voice calm but firm. Your Honor, my client remains committed to seeking accountability through a fair and public trial. However, we are willing to entertain a revised settlement offer if it adequately reflects the harm caused. Karen's lawyer rose immediately, clearing his throat. Your Honor, my client wishes to extend an updated settlement offer of $100,000 and a public apology to Mr. Robinson for the events in question. The gallery stirred, a wave of whispers rippling through the small audience. Karen's lawyer shot her a warning look, and she sat stiffly, her lips pressed into a thin line. Mark glanced at David, silently asking for his decision. David inhaled deeply before standing, his gaze steady as he addressed the court. Your Honor, while I appreciate the updated offer, this isn't just about money or apologies. What happened to me happens to people like me all the time. People who are judged and punished simply for existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. This case is about more than just me. It's about making sure this kind of behavior isn't excused or ignored. The judge nodded, her expression thoughtful. A valid point, Mr. Robinson. Ms. Miller, would you like to respond? Karen stood, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the edge of the table. Her voice, though shaky, carried an edge of defiance. Your Honor, I've already lost my job, my reputation, and everything I've worked for because of this. I've apologized, and I'm offering to make amends. What more does he want? To ruin me completely? David turned to face her directly, his voice calm but unyielding. What I want is for you to take responsibility, not just because you've lost things, but because you know what you did was wrong. You didn't just hurt me. You showed the world what happens when prejudice goes unchecked. That's what this is about." Karen's face flushed, her composure cracking further. "I've already said I made a mistake. But She gestured at David, her voice rising. "He's using this to destroy me. He's making me into some kind of monster." The judge's gavel struck sharply, cutting through Karen's outburst. "Ms. Miller, control yourself," she said, her tone icy. "This is not the time for dramatics." Karen's lawyer leaned toward her, whispering frantically. She shook her head at first, but his urgent tone seemed to break through. She slumped back into her chair, her expression a mixture of resentment and resignation. The judge turned back to Mark and David. "Mr. Bennett, Mr. Robinson, given the heightened tensions and the public attention on this case, I strongly encourage both parties to reach a resolution today. A trial may provide justice, but it will also prolong the harm for both sides." Mark stood, his voice measured. "Your Honor, we are open to settlement if it ensures meaningful accountability. However, any agreement must include a more substantial financial penalty and a formal, recorded admission of wrongdoing from Ms. Miller." The judge nodded. "Ms. Miller, your counsel may respond." Karen's lawyer stood, clearly rattled. "Your Honor, my client is willing to increase the settlement to $150,000 and provide a written apology. We strongly believe this is a fair resolution." David leaned toward Mark, his voice low. "It's not about the money. It's about making her understand what she did." Mark nodded, standing again. "Your Honor, the monetary offer is acceptable, but we insist the apology be delivered verbally in open court. Anything less undermines the accountability this case seeks to establish." The judge looked to Karen's lawyer, who hesitated before leaning toward his client. Their whispered exchange was heated, but brief. Finally, Karen stood, her face pale and drawn. "Fine," she said, her voice flat. "I'll apologize." The judge's eyes narrowed. "Ms. Miller, I hope you understand that an insincere apology will only reflect poorly on you and undermine any resolution." Karen's lips pressed into a thin line as she nodded curtly. "I understand, Your Honor." The judge turned back to the room. "Very well. This court will recess briefly while both parties finalize the terms of the settlement. We will reconvene shortly." The gavel struck again, and the room erupted in whispers as everyone stood. David remained in place, his heart pounding as he processed what had just unfolded. Mark placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You're doing the right thing," Mark said. "This isn't just about you. It's about making a statement." David nodded, his resolve solidifying. He wasn't seeking revenge. He was seeking change. And now, he was closer than ever to seeing it happen. The courtroom was silent when the judge returned and took her seat. The gavel struck sharply, commanding the attention of everyone present. Karen sat stiffly at the defendant's table, her expression strained, while David remained calm, his resolve unwavering. "This court is reconvened to finalize the settlement terms in the case of Robinson versus Miller," the judge announced. "Both parties have agreed to a monetary settlement of $150,000 and a public verbal apology to be delivered by the defendant. Miss Fonto Miller, you may proceed." Karen's lawyer leaned over, whispering something to her, but Karen barely acknowledged him. She stood slowly, her hands gripping the edge of the table as though it was the only thing keeping her upright. Her face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. Karen turned toward David, her eyes flickering with a mixture of resentment and defeat. Her voice, when she spoke, was tight and trembling. "Mr. Robinson," she began, pausing as if the words physically pained her, "I want to apologize for what happened in the park that day. I made assumptions about you that were unfair and wrong. I overreacted, and my actions caused you harm." David watched her carefully, his expression unreadable. The courtroom remained silent, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone present. Karen inhaled sharply, her hands tightening on the table. "I understand that my behavior was rooted in biases I should have recognized and addressed a long time ago. I let fear and prejudice guide my actions, and for that, I am deeply sorry." Her lawyer nudged her gently, and she added, "I take full responsibility for what I did and for the pain I caused you. I hope this apology can be the first step toward making things right." When she finished, she sat down abruptly, avoiding eye contact with David or anyone else in the room. Her hands shook slightly as she placed them in her lap. The judge turned to David. "Mr. Robinson, do you accept the terms of the settlement, including the defendant's apology?" David stood, his gaze steady as he looked first at the judge and then at Karen. "Yes, Your Honor, I accept." The judge nodded. "Then this case is settled. Ms. Miller, I hope you reflect on the consequences of your actions and take steps to ensure nothing like this happens again. Mr. Robinson, thank you for pursuing justice in a way that holds individuals accountable while fostering meaningful change." The gavel struck one final time, signaling the end of the proceedings. Karen remained seated. Her shoulders slumped as the courtroom began to clear. David turned to Mark, who gave him a firm handshake. "Well done," Mark said. "You handled this with grace. You've done more than get justice. You've set an example." Outside the courthouse, the air was crisp, the sunlight a stark contrast to the heavy atmosphere inside. Reporters swarmed the steps, microphones extended and cameras flashing. Mark guided David through the crowd, answering a few pointed questions. "Mr. Robinson, how do you feel about the resolution?" one reporter called. David paused, his voice calm but firm. "I'm relieved it's over, and I'm hopeful that this case sends a clear message. No one should be treated the way I was. And I hope this makes people think twice about their assumptions and actions." As Mark ushered him toward a waiting car, another reporter asked, "What's next for you, Mr. Joyce Robinson?" David hesitated for a moment before replying, "I'm going to keep doing what I've always done. Helping people and standing up for what's right. That doesn't change." Karen, meanwhile, slipped out of a side entrance with her lawyer, avoiding the reporters entirely. Her face was ashen as she climbed into the back seat of her husband's car. Greg sat silently in the driver's seat, his expression grim. As they pulled away, Karen stared out the window, her mind racing. The weight of her public humiliation and financial loss pressed down on her like a vice. She had always thought of herself as a good person, but now she was forced to confront the truth. Her actions had revealed something uglier than she'd ever cared to admit. Greg broke the silence. "You're going to have to figure out how to move forward from this," he said, his voice flat. "Not just for us, but for yourself." Karen didn't respond. For the first time, she realized she had no idea how to begin. David returned to the community center later that afternoon, the familiar hum of activity grounding him. Maria greeted him at the door, her smile warm but curious. "How'd it go?" she asked. David shrugged, his expression thoughtful. "It's done." She apologized, and we settled. Maria nodded, her tone soft. "And how do you feel?" David paused, considering the question. "I feel like it was worth it," he said finally. "Not just for me, but for everyone who's been through something like this and didn't get the chance to fight back." She smiled. "You did good, David. You really did." As he walked through the bustling center, the noise and energy of the space filled him with a sense of purpose. He didn't know what the future held, but for now, he was content to move forward, knowing he had done his part to make things a little better. The weeks following the court settlement brought a sense of calm back into David's life. The frenzy around the case began to fade, though the lessons it carried lingered in the public consciousness. News outlets covered the resolution sparingly, focusing more on the precedent it set than on Karen's personal downfall. David sat in his small apartment one quiet evening, flipping through a newspaper that featured an op-ed titled "Accountability in Action: The Robinson Case and What It Means for Us All." He read the piece slowly, letting the words sink in. The article praised his composure and willingness to fight for justice, framing him as a figure of quiet strength in the face of blatant injustice. He set the paper down and chuckled softly to himself. "All this," he murmured, shaking his head, "over a purse I didn't even want to touch." Across town, Karen sat at her dining table, A stack of bills and legal paperwork spread before her. The $150,000 settlement loomed over her like a dark cloud, the financial strain forcing her to make difficult choices. She had already sold her car and moved out of her upscale home into a modest apartment to free up money for the payout. Her lawyer had warned her that fighting the case further would cost even more, with no guarantee of success. And so, the woman who had accused David of trying to steal her purse now found herself writing checks to settle the debt she owed him. The irony wasn't lost on her, though she refused to dwell on it. Instead, she focused on her bitterness, replaying the events over and over in her mind, blaming everyone but herself. David returned to the community center, where life had returned to normal. The kids he mentored were back to running through the halls, their laughter echoing through the space. For him, the case had been a chapter, a significant one, but not the whole story of his life. One evening, as he packed up after a long day, Maria walked over, a sly smile on her face. "You've seen the latest, haven't you?" she asked, holding out her phone. David raised an eyebrow. "What now?" Maria handed him her phone, where a social media post from a local news outlet was displayed. It detailed Karen's financial struggles following the settlement, highlighting how she'd been forced to sell her belongings to pay the damages. "She's basically spent all the money she thought you were stealing," Maria said, her tone light but pointed. David laughed, a deep, genuine sound that he hadn't felt in weeks. "Life's got a funny way of balancing things out, doesn't it?" Maria nodded, her smile growing. "Sure does. But you made it happen, David. You didn't just let it slide. You stood up for yourself, and for a lot of other people who've been through the same thing." David's laughter faded, replaced by a quiet sense of pride. "Yeah," he said softly, "I guess I did." As he walked home that night, the cool evening breeze carried with it a sense of closure. He didn't feel anger or resentment anymore, just relief. He had fought for what was right, and though the journey had been painful, it had been worth it. Karen, he thought, might never truly understand the harm she had caused. But that wasn't his burden to carry. He had done what he could to hold her accountable, and the rest was up to her. David smiled faintly as he turned onto his street, the weight on his shoulders finally lifting. Life, after all, had a way of sorting things out.